Horror games have a problem. A note problem. A memo problem. I started noticing it back with the first Amnesia game in 2010. I kept coming across all these notes, to the point where it started feeling like a serious interruption to the pacing of gameplay. To be fair, Amnesia is at least courteous enough to warn you that it wants you to think of it more as a story than a game, but there has to be a better way to tell a story than asking someone to read pages of notes every couple minutes. And ever since that game, I've become hyper aware of the note reading phenomenon plaguing my favorite genre. Outlast, notes everywhere. Tormented Souls, notes in seemingly every room, filling out multiple people's diary entries across decades. Signalis, good lord, don't get me started on Signalis. One of my favorite new survival horror games, but it's not uncommon to find 2, even 3 notes in a single room. Whether it's action horror, survival horror, immersive sim with horror elements, so many games are guilty of this. Dead Space with its long notes explaining the history of the cult and the crew of the Ishimura. Alien Isolation with its endless number of slow consoles with documents that don't pertain to your central mission. Prey's novel worth of articles about space exploration and scientific discoveries. Doom 3's PDAs with what feels like 100 emails between staff about their experiments and fishing for locker codes. And the latest Amnesia game, The Bunker, where after coming across like 15 notes in the opening sections, I just tuned out. What's frustrating about it all is that often crucial information about the world and story are contained in these piles of notes, instead of integrated into the gameplay through environmental storytelling, smartly directed cutscenes, meaningful character interactions, etc. The player is left to spend hours sifting through notes, searching for anything that might help them understand what's actually going on. And unfortunately, many notes are full of inessential information. Emails between staff saying things like, hey, something weird is happening down on level 3, better send McKinley to check it out. November 3rd, cargo bay, delivery received, no label, clear safety violations in at least 3 areas. Better call Stevens, tired of us cargo workers being treated like second-class citizens down here. They better pray we don't unionize. Yes, they may all be little details that fit into the larger picture of the world, but you have to spend so much of your game time sifting through these documents, and if you ignore them, you could miss something important about the story, or much worse, a puzzle solution or passcode that could leave you unable to progress without it. It isn't a new problem. Doom 3 is almost 20 years old at this point, and games full of text go back to the original RPGs on the first Nintendo, and before that. But I'm seeing it more and more in modern horror games, particularly independent horror games. Tormented Souls, Amnesia the Bunker, and Signalis being my main examples of games that just sent me over the edge with their insane amount of note reading. And whenever I bring this up, I get pushback saying that horror games have always been like this, that the granddaddies of survival horror, Resident Evil and Silent Hill, the games I praise so much on this channel, told their stories through just as many notes. It's just part of the genre. But it really isn't the case. I invite anyone who thinks that to go back and play those games. Play Resident Evil 1 and tell me it's full of note reading. You'll see that in the entire opening mansion area, which will take a new player a couple hours to escape from, there's a total of 2 notes. When you finally reach the guardhouse, there's 2 more. They let you soak in the atmosphere for so long, and then when you come across a note, you actually want to read it. They satisfy your curiosity about the world, making you want to know more, and the information really sticks in your head. Not a single old-school Resident Evil player will ever forget the famous Itchy Tasty moment, coming across the diary of a resident of the mansion documenting his gradual degradation until he ultimately becomes a zombie. What another game would do in 20 notes trying to establish their world, Resident Evil did in 1. In Silent Hill 2, when you think of notes, what comes to mind? The news article about the murder found after saving Angela, the famous Walter Sullivan article about the Red Devil, the hospital diary about a depressed patient, some doctor and patient memos all relating to the central theme, and many of the notes you find are directly related to puzzles, figuring out where to go and what to do. You're not looking at 95% lore memos, which is typically what we see these days. On your first playthrough of an old Resident Evil or Silent Hill game, in an hour of gameplay you may come across a handful of notes, that's it. They are typically very short and to the point, only occasionally being multi-page. And when they are, like I said, they're either important to understanding puzzles, or they're delivering interesting story or world information that you're ready to hear at this point because you haven't been drowning in it. They're delivered at a pace that makes you feel comfortable reading them and absorbing information, and your mind has been trained to pay attention at this point. When you find a note in every room telling you about the world you're in, it gets exhausting, and I just stop caring. It takes a special game like Signalis for me to take the time to go back on another playthrough and read every note and try to understand what's happening. I love the world and story of Signalis so much, I just hate the way the information is delivered. So why is it delivered this way? I think the issue in many cases comes down to ambition versus capability. Many of these projects are created by small independent teams that simply don't have the resources to create a lot of engaging cutscenes or moments of specialized storytelling in gameplay. And while they're spending years creating their game, they keep expanding more and more on the stories they want to tell. They end up making all these complex mythologies, unable to resist the urge to explain the intricacies of every single location and character. Instead of simplifying their stories to deliver information at a better pace, we're left with 100 notes to collect. And like I mentioned in other examples, it doesn't just apply to indie games. Dead Space has so many notes fleshing out the world. It's nice to have this information if you want to dive in, but when is enough enough? Would people defend putting 5 notes in every room of Dead Space, saying, well, you don't have to read it if you don't want to? There's gotta be a limit. There's gotta be better ways of telling your stories. And I think developers need to find ways to reel in their narrative ambition at times. Dead Space does at least give you a general idea of the world naturally, and the main stuff concerning Nicole is directly experienced. So it's nowhere as big of an offender as other horror games. Some of these titles, it's literally impossible to have even a clue of what's happening without constant reading. I know that if note reading annoys me, I can just ignore it, but is it really fair that I don't get to enjoy or understand the world of any horror game I play without having to slog through pages upon pages of text? I wouldn't mind it so much in a walking sim, something that's really just trying to tell a story, and I'm not against having to read a bunch. Hell, I love the Emily is Away games, and they're just text. I also don't care about this nearly as much in a fast-paced action game. I'm so busy blasting monsters and flying through levels to care about what's really going on. If there's 100 notes, fine, maybe I'll come back to them someday. But we know that horror games are largely about mood and realistic immersion. We need context for the gameplay, because spooky lighting and jump scares only go so far. Horror games are a great medium for storytelling, largely because of their slow pace. I'd just like the developers to keep in mind that just because we're moving slowly through your game doesn't mean we want to stop every 2 minutes and read a 5-page diary entry. Before I end this, I'll take a moment to say this isn't a universal problem. Of course, there are games that do a much better job. Nightmare of Decay had a very small amount of note reading. Cry of Fear basically delivers its story at the pacing of a classic Silent Hill. Paratopic leaves its story up to you to figure out, as it's more of an art project than a game. I'm not saying that every game has this problem, but I've played enough recently that do have it to make me want to say something about it. I talked with horror content creator Tango Mushi on my recent podcast about this. Check out that conversation, and we talk a lot about Silent Hill. Anyways, I'm Under the Mayo, thanks for watching.